Some losses cut so deep you think they'll stay buried forever. For wealthy cattleman Elias Boone, 30 years of grief had settled into the quiet rhythm of morning fishing on the lake, where he once ran cattle. When his net pulled up a heavy rusted chest from the muddy bottom, he expected driftwood or scrap metal. Instead, he found letters, toys, and a faded photograph of his wife and son lost in a stagecoach accident decades ago, their bodies never recovered. The chest was her keepsake trunk, carried downstream by time and buried in lake mud. But what happens when a man's deepest sorrow suddenly surfaces in his fishing nets? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Boone Ranch, stretching 40,000 acres of Montana's finest grazing land beneath a sky so wide it seemed to swallow the earth whole. Elias Boone stood on the wraparound porch of his sprawling log home, watching steam rise from his coffee cup while the day awakened around him. At 68, he carried himself with the steady bearing of a man who had wrestled this land into submission through sheer will and decades of back-breaking work. The house behind him told the story of his success: hand-hewn timber beams, river rock fireplace that could warm half the county, and picture windows that framed the Rocky Mountains like living paintings. But for all its grandeur, the house felt hollow. Too many empty rooms, too many silent hallways where laughter should have echoed. "Morning, boss!" Jake Morrison's voice carried across the yard as the ranch foreman approached, his weathered face already showing the day's first smile. At 55, Jake had worked the Boone Ranch for nearly 20 years, watching Elias transform from a driven businessman into something closer to a hermit with livestock. "Morning, Jake." Elias nodded toward the horizon where cattle dotted the landscape like scattered pennies. "How are they looking today?" "Fat and happy. The new pasture rotation is working better than we hoped." Jake paused, studying his boss's face with the careful attention of a man who had learned to read moods like weather. "You seem different this morning. Something happened at the lake?" Elias's fingers tightened around his coffee cup. The rusted chest sat in his truck bed, covered by an old tarp, but its presence weighed on him like a stone in his chest. "Found something unusual. Nothing that affects the ranch." Jake's eyebrows rose slightly, but he knew better than to press. Elias Boone was not a man who shared easily, a trait that had served him well in business, but poorly in the years since the accident. The foreman had watched his boss retreat further into himself with each passing season, building walls higher than any fence they had ever strung. The screen door creaked open behind them, and Maria Santos emerged with a plate of warm biscuits and her characteristic frown of concern. At 62, she had been keeping the Boone household running for 15 years, ever since Elias finally accepted that he could not live on black coffee and stubborn pride alone. Her grey hair was pulled back in its customary bun, and her dark eyes missed nothing. "You did not eat breakfast again," she said, setting the plate on the porch railing with more force than necessary. "A man cannot live on air and regret, Senor Boone." "I'm fine, Maria." But Elias reached for a biscuit anyway, knowing that resistance was futile when Maria Santos made up her mind about something. "Fine," she repeated, her accent softening the word into something musical. "You are many things, Senor Boone, but fine is not one of them. Not for 30 years. Jake cleared his throat, sensing the familiar tension that arose whenever Maria tried to mother their boss back to the land of the living. "I should check on the south pasture. That new bull has been causing trouble." "Take the side-by-side," Elias said, "and keep an eye on the fence line near Miller's property. I don't trust that man's cattle to respect boundaries." As Jake strode away, Maria settled into the porch swing with her own cup of coffee, a sure sign that she intended to stay and speak her mind. Elias had learned to recognize these moments when his housekeeper transformed from employee to the closest thing he had to family. 30 years ago today, she said quietly. "You hired me to help care for a house that held a family. Now I care for a house that holds only ghosts." Elias stiffened. He had hoped the date might pass unnoticed, but Maria's memory was as sharp as her tongue. June 15th. The day Catherine and Tommy had left for their visit to Elizabeth, Catherine's sister, in Denver. The day everything changed. "Maria, I know you do not like to speak of them," she continued, her voice gentle but firm. "But forgetting is not the same as healing, and healing is not the same as betraying their memory." The words hung in the morning air like smoke. Elias walked to the porch railing, gripping the wood until his knuckles went white. In the distance, a meadowlark called across the pasture, its song bright and clean in the crisp air. He had built an empire on this land, starting with nothing but a fierce determination to prove himself worthy of the woman who had agreed to marry a poor ranch hand with more dreams than sense. The Boone Ranch now employed 37 people, ran 5,000 head of cattle, and generated enough profit to buy half the county. Elias's name commanded respect in boardrooms from Denver to Chicago, but none of it mattered. Not the money, not the land, not the respect. None of it could fill the silence that had consumed his life since that terrible spring day when a flash flood had swept away the stagecoach, carrying his entire world. They were coming home from visiting Elizabeth, he said, the words scraping his throat raw. Catherine wanted Tommy to meet his aunt's new baby. Said family was important, that we needed to stay connected. Maria said nothing, but her presence felt like an anchor in the storm of his memory. I should have gone with them. Should have insisted we all travel together. But I had business in town, contracts to sign. He laughed bitterly. Always had business. Always had something more important than spending time with my wife and son. The flood was not your fault, Senor Boone. Wasn't it? He turned to face her, 30 years of grief etched into every line of his weathered face. I put business before family. I let them travel alone on mountain roads in spring, when the snowmelt turns every creek into a torrent. I did that. Maria's coffee cup clinked against the porch swing as she set it down and rose to her feet. You loved them. That is what you did. You loved them so much that you built all this. She gestured toward the sprawling ranch to prove you were worthy of them. But mi amigo, you were already worthy. They knew it then, and they would know it now. Elias felt something crack inside his chest, a fissure in the careful control he had maintained for 3 decades. The chest in his truck seemed to pulse with significance, as if Catherine herself were calling to him from across the years. I found something at the lake this morning, he said finally. Something that belonged to them. Maria's breath caught. What kind of something? A chest. Catherine's chest. It must have been in the stagecoach when... He could not finish the sentence, could not speak aloud the image of churning water and splintered wood that haunted his dreams. Dios mio. Maria crossed herself, her eyes wide with wonder and concern. After all these years, the lake gives back what it took. I haven't opened it fully, just enough to see. He swallowed hard. Just enough to know it's theirs. Where is it now? In the truck. He nodded toward the vehicle parked near the barn. I don't know if I can bear to see what's inside, but I don't think I can bear not to see it either. Maria studied his face with the careful attention of a woman who had spent 15 years learning to read the subtle signs of his pain. Perhaps you do not have to face it alone. Perhaps it is time to let someone help carry the burden. The suggestion terrified him more than any business deal, more than any natural disaster that had threatened his livelihood over the years. For 30 years, his grief had been a private thing, locked away in the deepest chambers of his heart. To share it now felt like standing naked in a blizzard. But as he looked at Maria's kind face, at the genuine love and concern in her dark eyes, he felt the first stirring of something he had not experienced in decades. Hope. Fragile and frightening, but undeniably real. Would you, he cleared his throat, trying again, would you help me look through it? I'm not sure I can do it alone. Of course. Her smile was radiant. We will do it together. And Jake too, if you wish. He has been like family to you, whether you admit it or not. Elias nodded, not trusting his voice. As they walked toward the truck, each step felt like moving through deep water, but for the first time in 30 years, he was not swimming alone. The chest sat in the truck bed like a sleeping dragon, its rusted surface dark with lake mud and trailing strands of green moss. Up close, Elias could see the decorative ironwork that had once made it beautiful, delicate roses and vines that Catherine had admired when they bought it for their first home together. It was her hope chest, he said quietly. Her mother gave it to her when we got engaged. She kept all her treasures in it. Maria reached out to touch the metal surface, then drew her hand back as if it might burn her. It has waited 30 years to come home. That must mean something. Before Elias could respond, Jake's voice called out from across the yard. Boss, everything, all right? The foreman had returned from the pasture and was approaching with the cautious gait of a man who sensed something significant was happening. Jake, Elias called back, I need to ask you something. Both of you. He looked between his two most trusted employees, the closest thing to family he had left in the world. I need to open this chest, and I need witnesses. People who will remember whatever we find inside. Jake's eyes widened as he took in the rusted container. That came from the lake? It belonged to my wife and son. The words came easier this time, as if speaking them aloud had loosened something inside his throat. I think I've been waiting for this moment for 30 years. I just didn't know it. Maria reached for his hand, her calloused fingers warm and strong. Then let us see what the lake has returned to you, Senor Boone. Let us see what Catherine has been keeping safe all these years. As the three of them stood around the truck in the morning sunlight, Elias felt the first stirring of a truth he had buried beneath decades of guilt and grief. Perhaps some things were not lost forever. Perhaps love, like hope, had a way of finding its way home. The hinges of the chest protested with a grinding shriek as Elias lifted the heavy lid, lake water still seeping from its corners onto the truck bed. Maria gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth, while Jake removed his hat in a gesture of unconscious respect. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow preserved them through 3 decades underwater, lay the remnants of a life cut short. Catherine's wedding ring sat atop a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, the gold band tarnished but intact. Engraved inside the band, barely visible but still legible, were the words E and C, forever, June 20th, 1967. Elias's fingers trembled as he lifted it, remembering the day he had slipped it onto her finger in the little church outside Billings, promising her a love that would last until the mountains crumbled to dust. Oh, Senor Boone, Maria whispered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. She kept it safe for you. Beneath the ring lay a small, hand-carved wooden horse, no bigger than a man's thumb. Tommy's favorite toy, whittled by Elias, during long winter evenings when his son would sit beside him, asking endless questions about the ranch, about cattle, about everything under the sun. The boy had named it Ranger and carried it everywhere, galloping it across tabletops and fence rails while making soft, neighing sounds that never failed to make Catherine laugh. Jake cleared his throat roughly. I remember that horse. Tommy used to bring it out to the barn when he'd help with chores. Said Ranger was going to be a real ranch horse someday. He was going to teach it to herd cattle, Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. Said it just needed to grow up first, like him. But it was the letters that broke him. 23 envelopes, each addressed in Catherine's careful script to different people, her sister, Elizabeth, her mother back in Kansas, her childhood friend, Margaret. Letters she had planned to mail from Denver, thoughts and dreams she had wanted to share with the world. The top envelope, however, bore his own name. For my dearest Elias, to read when I return. With shaking hands, he opened the letter, addressed to him. The paper had survived remarkably well, Catherine's elegant handwriting still clear and strong across the page. As he read, her voice seemed to whisper across 30 years of silence. "My darling husband, by the time you read this, Tommy and I will be home from our visit with Elizabeth, and I will have told you all these things in person. But I wanted to write them down anyway, because sometimes the heart speaks more clearly through the pen than through the lips." Elias had to stop reading, overcome by an emotion so powerful it threatened to drive him to his knees. Catherine's voice, preserved in ink and time, speaking to him as if she had just stepped out for a moment and would return any second with that bright smile that had lit up his world. "She wrote about you," he managed to say, looking up at Maria and Jake. "About us, about the future we were planning." Maria moved closer, her maternal instincts overriding any sense of propriety. "What does she say?" "She talks about expanding the ranch, about having more children. She had ideas for a garden behind the house, wanted to plant roses and vegetables." His voice cracked. "She says she loves watching me work with Tommy, teaching him about the land and the animals. She says I'm already the father she always dreamed their children would have." The words hit him like a physical blow. For 30 years, he had carried the crushing weight of believing himself a failure as a husband and father, a man who had prioritized business over family until it was too late. But here, in Catherine's own words, was proof that she had seen him differently. She had seen love where he had seen only inadequacy. Jake shifted uncomfortably, unused to such raw emotion, but unwilling to leave his boss to face this alone. "Sounds like she knew you pretty well. Better than I knew myself." Elias carefully folded the letter and tucked it back into its envelope. "There are others here," addressed to her family. "Letters they never received because—" He could not finish the sentence. "Because the flood took them before they could be sent," Maria said gently. "But they were not lost. They were waiting for you to be ready to hear her voice again." Among the other items in the chest, Elias found a pressed flower collection, delicate blooms Catherine had gathered from their walks around the ranch, each one labeled with the date and location where she had found it. A small leather journal filled with her sketches of birds and wildflowers. Tommy's school report card from the spring of 1979, showing straight A's, and a teacher's note praising his bright mind and gentle spirit. But it was the unopened letter addressed to Elizabeth that gave him the most pause. Catherine's sister, whom he had not spoken to since the funeral 30 years ago. The sister who had blamed herself for the accident because Catherine and Tommy had been traveling to see her new baby. The sister who had tried to reach out to Elias in the months after the tragedy, only to be met with his stubborn, grief-stricken silence. "I should have stayed in touch with Elizabeth," he said, holding the letter up to the light as if it might reveal its secrets. "She was Catherine's only family left, and I shut her out because it hurt too much to see Catherine's eyes looking back at me from her face." "It is never too late to mend a fence," Jake offered, his rancher's wisdom extending beyond cattle and pasture land. "Sometimes the best time to fix something is right when you realize it's broken." Maria nodded emphatically. This letter, it was meant for Elizabeth. Perhaps it was meant to find its way to her, even after all these years. Elias turned the envelope over in his hands, studying Catherine's careful script. His wife had been the keeper of family connections, the one who remembered birthdays and anniversaries, who insisted they stay in touch with distant relatives and old friends. She would be heartbroken to know how thoroughly he had isolated himself after her death. "I don't even know if Elizabeth is still alive," he admitted. "Last I heard, she had remarried and moved somewhere in Colorado. That was 20 years ago." "Then we find her," Maria said, with the fierce determination of a woman accustomed to solving problems through action rather than worry. "We find her, and we deliver this letter. It is what Catherine would want." The thought terrified him more than facing a charging bull or navigating a blizzard on horseback. To reach out to Elizabeth would mean acknowledging the family connections he had severed in his grief. It would mean admitting that he had been wrong to retreat so completely into himself, wrong to build walls so high that even love could not scale them. But as he looked at the treasures spread before him, the ring that symbolized a love that had transcended death, the toy horse that represented a son's innocent dreams, the letters that proved he had been cherished even more than he knew, Elias felt something shift inside his chest. The protective shell of numbness he had worn for 3 decades began to crack, letting in the first rays of hope he had felt since that terrible day when the sheriff had knocked on his door with news that would shatter his world. "We'll find her," he said finally, his voice growing stronger with each word. "We'll find Elizabeth, and we'll deliver this letter. And maybe," he paused, hardly daring to voice the thought, "maybe we'll find out what Catherine wanted to tell her, what she wanted to share about our life together." Maria smiled through her tears, reaching out to squeeze his shoulder. "Perhaps we will also find out that some things that seem lost forever are simply waiting for the right moment to come home." As they carefully repacked the chest, treating each item like the precious relic it was, Elias felt the first stirring of a purpose beyond mere survival. For 30 years, he had been existing rather than living, going through the motions of daily life, while his heart remained buried with his family. But the lake had returned Catherine's treasures to him, along with a message he was only now ready to hear: that love does not die with the beloved, that family connections can be rebuilt even after decades of silence, and that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is allow his heart to break open and feel again. The quest to find Elizabeth would begin tomorrow. Tonight he would read every letter in that chest, hearing Catherine's voice whisper across the years, reminding him of the man he used to be and challenging him to become the man she had always believed him capable of being. The search for Elizabeth began at dawn the next morning, when Elias spread 30 years' worth of accumulated papers across his kitchen table like a detective working a cold case. Maria bustled around him with fresh coffee and determined efficiency, while Jake sat nearby, offering the kind of steady moral support that came naturally to a man who had spent his life gentling spooked horses and stubborn cattle. Among Catherine's letters, Elias found fragments of Elizabeth's life scattered like breadcrumbs across the years. References to her move from Denver to Colorado Springs after her first husband's death. Mentions of her remarriage to a man named Robert Crenshaw. Catherine's excitement about becoming an aunt to Elizabeth's stepchildren, whom she had planned to visit during that fateful trip. "Here," Maria said, pointing to a letter dated just weeks before the accident. "Catherine writes about Elizabeth's new baby girl, born in February 1979. The child would be 31 years old now." Elias studied Catherine's flowing script, trying to piece together a life he had deliberately forgotten. Elizabeth Ann Morrison became Elizabeth Ann Crenshaw. That's something to work with. Jake leaned back in his chair, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug. "Colorado Springs isn't that big a town. Records office might have something, or maybe the hospital where the baby was born." The practical aspects of the search felt manageable, but the emotional weight pressed down on Elias like a lead blanket. Among Catherine's belongings, he had found Tommy's final school report card, the one that would have been his last before summer vacation. The teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had written a note in her careful script: "Tommy is a joy to have in class." His curiosity about the natural world and his kindness toward other children make him a natural leader. I look forward to seeing what wonderful things he accomplishes in 4th grade. 4th grade. A grade Tommy would never see. Dreams he would never fulfill, adventures he would never experience. The boy had been 8 years old when he died, still young enough to believe that his wooden horse would someday grow into a real one, still innocent enough to think that all stories had happy endings. "I keep thinking about what she wrote," Elias said, turning Tommy's report card over in his hands. "Catherine, in her letter to me, she talked about our future, about giving Tommy brothers and sisters, about watching our children grow up on this land. Maria's eyes softened with understanding. You have carried the grief of not just what was lost, but what never had the chance to be. Every decision I've made for 30 years has been about avoiding that kind of hope, he admitted. Building walls high enough that nothing could hurt me like that again, but also high enough that nothing good could get in, either. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair, unused to such personal revelations, but committed to seeing his boss through whatever this journey required. Maybe that's why the chest came up now. Maybe you're finally ready to let some good back in. The phone calls began that afternoon. Elias started with directory assistance in Colorado Springs, his heart hammering as he asked the operator to search for Robert and Elizabeth Crenshaw. The first number had been disconnected. The second belonged to a different Robert Crenshaw entirely, a man who politely informed Elias that he had never been married to anyone named Elizabeth. By evening, Elias had exhausted the obvious avenues without success. The Colorado Springs Records Office would not release information over the phone. The hospital where Elizabeth's daughter had been born required in-person identification before they would confirm or deny any records. The trail had gone cold before it had ever really warmed up. This is harder than I thought it would be, he admitted to Maria as she prepared dinner in the ranch kitchen. Maybe Elizabeth doesn't want to be found. Maybe she's built her own walls. Or maybe, Maria said, stirring a pot of stew with the same steady rhythm she brought to all of life's challenges, she is waiting for someone to knock on those walls, the same way you were waiting, without knowing it, for 30 years. That evening, Elias sat in his study reading Tommy's report card by lamplight. The boy's teacher had noted his particular interest in science, his questions about how plants grew and why animals behaved the way they did. Catherine had written in the margins proud notations about Tommy's curiosity and his plans to be a rancher scientist when he grew up. He wanted to improve the grass, Elias said aloud to the empty room, remembering conversations with his son that he had not allowed himself to think about for decades. Said he was going to invent grass that cows liked better, grass that would make them happier. The memory hit him with unexpected force. Tommy, earnest and 8 years old, explaining his grand plans while they walked the pastures together. The boy had been fascinated by the relationship between the land and the animals, already showing signs of the innovative thinking that might have transformed ranching in ways Elias could never have imagined. But those dreams had drowned with their dreamer in the spring floods of 1979, leaving behind only a wooden horse and a father too, broken to remember that love was meant to honor the living, not just mourn the dead. Unable to sleep, Elias walked out to the barn, where Jake was checking on a mare due to foal any day. The building smelled of hay and horses, leather, and the indefinable comfort of animals at rest. This was where he felt most at peace, surrounded by the rhythms of ranch life that had sustained him through 3 decades of grief. "Any luck with the search?" Jake asked, not looking up from the mare's stall. "Dead ends so far, but I'm not giving up." The words surprised Elias with their conviction. "For the first time in 30 years I have a purpose beyond just getting through the day. I'm not going to let Elizabeth slip away again." Jake nodded approvingly. "Sometimes the most important work takes the longest to finish. This mare here, she's been carrying this foal for 11 months. But when that baby comes, it'll be worth every day of waiting." As if responding to their conversation, the mare shifted restlessly in her stall, her sides heaving with the weight of new life. Nature's reminder that some things could not be rushed, that growth and healing happened in their own time, at their own pace. "I'm going to Colorado Springs myself," Elias decided. "I'm going to knock on doors if I have to, visit every record office and hospital until I find some trace of her. This letter," he patted his shirt pocket where he carried Catherine's unopened message to Elizabeth. "It's waited 30 years to reach its destination. I won't let it wait any longer." Jake smiled, the first genuine smile Elias had seen from his foreman in months. "About time you got off this ranch for something other than cattle sales. Maria and I can handle things here," You go find your family." The word hung in the barn like a prayer. Family. Something Elias had convinced himself he no longer had or deserved. But perhaps Jake was right. Perhaps it was time to discover whether the connections that mattered most could survive even 3 decades of neglect and grief. 3 days later, Elias found himself sitting at his kitchen table with a fountain pen in his hand and a blank sheet of paper before him, struggling to find words that had been buried beneath 30 years of silence. Outside, a spring storm rattled the windows, while inside, the weight of unspoken grief pressed down on him like the low-hanging clouds that obscured the mountain peaks. He had decided to write to Elizabeth before making the trip to Colorado Springs, reasoning that a letter might accomplish what a surprise visit could not. But how do you reach across 3 decades of silence? How do you explain why a man who once called you sister simply vanished from your life when you needed him most? "Dear Elizabeth," he wrote, then stopped. The words felt inadequate, formal and cold, when what he wanted to convey was the opposite. He crumpled the paper and started again. "Elizabeth, I don't know if you'll remember me, or if you'll want to after all these years of silence on my part. My name is Elias Boone, and I was married to your sister Catherine. Better, more honest, but still missing something essential, an acknowledgement of the pain he had caused, the family connections he had severed in his grief. Maria found him there an hour later, surrounded by crumpled attempts and looking more frustrated than she had seen him since the day he had tried to repair the barn roof himself and ended up hanging from the eaves like a scarecrow. "Writing is harder than ranching," she observed, settling into the chair beside him with her own cup of coffee. "I don't know what to say to her. How do you apologize for disappearing from someone's life when they needed you most? How do you explain that grief made me so selfish I couldn't see past my own pain?" Maria studied the scattered papers, then reached for Catherine's pressed flower collection, which had become Elias's constant companion since discovering the chest. The small leather-bound book contained dozens of delicate blooms, each one carefully preserved between sheets of waxed paper and labeled in Catherine's neat handwriting. "Bluebells from the North Pasture, May 15th, 1978, Maria read aloud. "Wild Roses from the Creek Bank, June 3rd, 1978. "Indian Paintbrush from the High Meadow, July 20th, 1978. She looked up at Elias with understanding in her dark eyes. She saw beauty everywhere, your Catherine. She collected moments of joy like other people collect coins. Elias nodded, remembering how Catherine would stop during their walks to exclaim over a particularly perfect wildflower or an interesting rock formation. She had possessed an artist's eye for beauty and a child's capacity for wonder, qualities that had made even the most ordinary ranch tasks feel like adventures when she was beside him. "She tried to teach me to see the way she saw," he said, "always pointing out colors I missed, shapes in clouds, the way light moved across the grass at different times of day. I was too busy thinking about profit margins and breeding schedules to really listen." "But you listen now," Maria pointed out. "When you walk the property each morning, I see you stop to look at things the way she did. Her eyes live in yours now, whether you realize it or not." The observation struck him with unexpected force. It was true somewhere over the years, without conscious effort, he had begun to see the ranch through Catherine's eyes. He noticed wildflowers blooming in fence corners, appreciated the way morning light painted the barn walls gold, paused to watch hawks circling overhead with the same fascination she had shown. "Maybe that's what I tell Elizabeth," he said slowly. "That Catherine's way of seeing has never really left this place, that her love is still here, in the land she helped me build into something beautiful." With renewed purpose, he took up his pen again. "Elizabeth, 30 years ago I lost more than a wife and son. I lost my way entirely. In my grief, I cut myself off from everyone who had loved Catherine, including you. I told myself it was too painful to maintain those connections, But the truth is simpler and more shameful. I was too broken to think about anyone's pain but my own. 3 days ago, something extraordinary happened. While fishing the lake where Catherine and I used to walk, my net pulled up a chest from the bottom, Catherine's hope chest, lost in the flood that took them from us. Inside, I found letters she wrote, but never had the chance to send, including one addressed to you. I don't know what she wanted to tell you, but I know it was important enough for her to carry that letter on her final journey. I also know that I have no right to ask anything of you after so many years of silence. But if you're willing to see me, I would like to bring Catherine's letter to you myself. I think it's time I learned what my wife wanted to share with her sister, and perhaps it's time I tried to rebuild the family connections I was too afraid to maintain. I understand if you would prefer not to reopen old wounds, but if you're willing to give a foolish old man a chance to make amends, I will travel wherever you are to deliver what Catherine wanted you to have. He signed the letter simply, Elias, and sealed it before he could change his mind. Finding Elizabeth's current address had required a call to the Denver Public Library, where a helpful librarian had searched marriage records and found Elizabeth Ann Crenshaw listed in a 1995 divorce decree. From there, a private investigator hired for one afternoon had tracked her to Durango, Colorado, where she apparently ran a small flower shop called Catherine's Garden. The name stopped Elias cold when the investigator called with the information. Catherine's Garden. After all these years, Elizabeth had named her business after her sister, keeping that connection alive even when he had let it die through neglect. She never forgot, he said to Maria after sharing the news. All these years I thought I was the only one carrying their memory, but Elizabeth was honoring Catherine too, in her own way. Perhaps she has been waiting as long as you have, Maria suggested. Perhaps she needs to heal old wounds as much as you do. That evening, as Elias walked the property with Catherine's flower collection in hand, he tried to see the ranch through her eyes, not as an economic enterprise, but as a living canvas of beauty and possibility. The storm had cleared, leaving the air clean and sharp, and wildflowers dotted the pastures like scattered gems. For the first time in 30 years, he picked a small bouquet wild roses from the creek bank, just like the ones Catherine had pressed in her book. Tomorrow, he would mail the letter to Elizabeth. Whatever happened next, he would face it with his wife's gift for finding beauty in unexpected places, and her unwavering belief that love was strong enough to bridge any distance, heal any wound, and survive even death itself. Elizabeth's response arrived 7 days later, delivered by a mail carrier who probably had no idea he was carrying 30 years of hope and fear in his weathered leather satchel. Elias found the envelope propped against his coffee cup at the kitchen table, placed there by Maria with the careful reverence she might have shown a piece of sacred scripture. The return address read, Elizabeth Hartwell, Catherine's Garden, Durango, Colorado. Hartwell, not Crenshaw. Another marriage, another name change, another layer of life lived in the absence of family connection. Elias turned the envelope over in his hands, noting the careful script that bore an unmistakable resemblance to Catherine's elegant handwriting. With trembling fingers, he opened the letter and unfolded pages covered in the same careful penmanship. Dear Elias, I have read your letter a dozen times since it arrived 2 days ago, each reading bringing a different emotion, surprise, grief, hope, and yes, anger, that it took 30 years for either of us to reach across the silence we both helped create. You speak of your guilt, but I must tell you that I have carried my own burden all these years. Catherine and Tommy were traveling to see me when they died. If I hadn't insisted they come, if I hadn't been so eager to show off my new baby daughter, they would have been safe at home with you. I have lived with that knowledge for 3 decades, and it has shaped every day of my life since. I named my shop Catherine's Garden because I needed to believe that something of her beauty could still grow in this world, even after she was gone. Every flower I arrange, every bride I help choose her bouquet, I do it in memory of a sister who saw poetry in petals and magic in the simplest bloom. Yes, I want to see you. Yes, I want to receive Catherine's letter. But more than that, I want to understand how we both survived the loss of the two people who mattered most to us, and why it took a chest rising from a lake to remind us that we still have each other. I cannot travel to Montana. My arthritis makes long trips difficult, and I have responsibilities here that I cannot leave. But if you meant what you wrote about coming to deliver Catherine's letter, I will be waiting. My address is enclosed, along with my phone number. Call me when you decide, and we will arrange a meeting that is 30 years overdue. With love and forgiveness for us both, Elizabeth. Elias read the letter 3 times before the full impact hit him. Elizabeth had been carrying guilt that mirrored his own, the terrible weight of believing herself responsible for Catherine and Tommy's deaths. While he had blamed himself for letting them travel alone, she had blamed herself for giving them a reason to travel at all. "We were both fools," he said aloud to the empty kitchen, "both carrying blame that belonged to no one but the storm that swept them away." But there was something else in Elizabeth's letter that struck him even more powerfully. The revelation that she had been honoring Catherine's memory through her work with flowers, keeping her sister's love of beauty alive in a tangible way. All these years, while he had been building walls against grief, Elizabeth had been building bridges to hope. Maria found him an hour later, still sitting at the table, with the letter spread before him like a map to a country he had forgotten existed. "Good news or bad news?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him with the ease of long familiarity. "Complicated news," he replied, handing her the letter. "She wants to see me, but she's been carrying the same guilt I have. She thinks she's responsible for their deaths because they were coming to visit her." Maria read quickly, her eyebrows rising as she took in Elizabeth's words. "Dios mío. 30 years, you have both been punishing yourselves for something neither of you could control." "I need to see her," Elias said, "not just to deliver Catherine's letter, but to help her understand that she's not to blame, that neither of us is to blame." Jake appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of serious conversation. "Everything all right?" "Better than all right," Maria said, waving Elizabeth's letter. "Senor Boone is going to Colorado to mend a heart that has been broken as long as his own." The practicalities of the trip loomed large. Elias had not traveled beyond the county borders in 15 years, had not stayed in a hotel since a cattle auction in Denver that had ended badly when he realized how much the world had changed in his absence. The thought of navigating airports and rental cars, of sleeping in unfamiliar beds and eating in strange restaurants, filled him with a dread that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with how small his world had become. Among Catherine's belongings, he found Tommy's hand-drawn map of the ranch, a child's treasure that showed secret hideouts and adventure spots with the boundless imagination of an 8-year-old explorer. Tommy had marked a dozen locations with elaborate drawings: the Dragon Cave, actually a root cellar, the pirate ship, an old wagon frame, the castle, a rock outcropping near the creek. Looking at his son's map, Elias realized how much wonder he had lost along with his family. When had he stopped seeing magic in ordinary places? When had he forgotten that adventure could be found in his own backyard? That joy was as close as the next sunrise. "I want to take this with me," he told Maria, holding up Tommy's map. "And Catherine's flower book. I want Elizabeth to see how they lived, not just how they died." "A fine idea," Maria agreed. "Show her the children they were, the dreams they carried. Show her that their lives were about more than their ending." That evening, Elias called Elizabeth's number, his heart hammering as the phone rang across the miles. When she answered, her voice carried the same musical quality he remembered from 3 decades past, though seasoned now with years and experience. "Elizabeth, this is Elias." "I was hoping you would call," she said, and he could hear tears in her voice. "I was afraid you might change your mind." "No," he said firmly. No more changing minds, no more silence. I'll drive down next week if that works for you. I have things to show you, things of Catherine and Tommy's that you should see. I have things to show you too, she replied. Letters I wrote to you over the years but never sent. Photographs of Catherine from when we were girls. Stories about her that you might not know. As they made arrangements for his visit, Elias felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight bands of grief that had constricted his heart for so long. The journey to Colorado would be about more than delivering a letter. It would be about reclaiming a connection that death had interrupted but never truly severed, about learning that family could survive even the longest silence, and about discovering that healing often required the courage to share our deepest wounds with those who understood them best. The drive to Colorado took Elias through country he had not seen in decades, winding mountain roads that carried him past forests of aspen and pine, through valleys where wildflowers painted the meadows in broad strokes of purple and gold. Catherine's recipe book lay on the passenger seat beside him, its pages filled with handwritten instructions for the meals she had loved to prepare for their small family. He had discovered the book while packing for the trip, tucked beneath other treasures in the chest, like a secret waiting to be revealed. Page after page of Catherine's careful script detailed not just ingredients and cooking times, but family memories woven into every recipe. Tommy's favorite cornbread, add extra honey. He says it tastes like sunshine. Elias's birthday cake, chocolate with vanilla frosting, the same recipe his mother used, makes him smile every time. Reading her notes was like hearing Catherine's voice again, full of love and attention to the details that made a house into a home. She had understood something that he had forgotten in his years of solitary existence, that food was more than sustenance, that the act of preparing meals for loved ones was itself a form of prayer, a daily offering of care and connection. The hotel in Durango felt alien after 30 years of sleeping under the same Montana sky. The walls seemed too thin, the sounds too foreign, the bed too soft for a man accustomed to the firm mattress he had shared with Catherine decades ago. Elias lay awake, listening to traffic and strangers' voices through the windows, clutching Tommy's wooden horse like a talisman against the unfamiliarity of the world beyond his ranch. At 3 a.m, unable to sleep, he called the ranch. Jake answered on the second ring, sounding alert despite the hour. "Boss? Everything all right?" "Can't sleep," Elias admitted. "This place feels wrong. Too many people, too much noise. I forgot how big the world was outside the ranch." Jake's chuckle carried across the miles, warm and reassuring. "First night away from home is always the hardest. Remember when I went to my sister's wedding in Minneapolis? Called you from the hotel parking lot, ready to drive straight back to Montana. But you stayed. I stayed because I had something important to do, just like you do. How are you feeling about tomorrow?" Elias considered the question seriously. Tomorrow he would meet Elizabeth face to face for the first time in 30 years, would deliver Catherine's letter and share the treasures that had emerged from the lake. Tomorrow he would begin the work of rebuilding a family connection that grief had severed. Terrified, he said honestly. "What if she's changed too much? What if I have? What if we don't know how to talk to each other anymore?" "Then you'll figure it out as you go," Jake said, with the practical wisdom that made him invaluable as a ranch foreman and irreplaceable as a friend. "You've got Catherine's letter and her memories to guide the conversation. Sometimes the best words come when you stop trying so hard to find them." After hanging up, Elias picked up Catherine's recipe book and turned to a page she had titled "Sunday Dinners for Family." The recipe for pot roast was accompanied by a long note about the importance of gathering around the table, about how food tasted better when it was shared, about the conversations that happened over the simple ritual of a shared meal. "Elizabeth loved my pot roast when we were girls," Catherine had written. "She always asked for seconds and praised my cooking, even when I knew it wasn't that good. She has such a generous heart, always making others feel special. I hope someday our children will know their aunt's kindness the way I did growing up." The note hit him like a physical blow. Catherine had planned for their children to know Elizabeth, had wanted to maintain the family connections that he had severed in his grief. She had understood something that 30 years of isolation had made him forget, that family was not just about bloodlines, but about the choice to remain connected, even when distance and time tried to pull you apart. Morning came grey and drizzly, the kind of weather that made the Colorado mountains look brooding and mysterious. Elias dressed carefully, choosing the same black suit he had worn to Catherine and Tommy's funeral 30 years ago. It seemed appropriate. Somehow this journey was about honoring the dead while learning to live again. Catherine's garden occupied a corner lot on Durango's main street, its windows bright with displays of fresh flowers and seasonal arrangements. The sign above the door showed a delicate rose painted in soft watercolors, and underneath in elegant script, Elizabeth Hartwell, proprietor, bringing beauty to life's special moments. Through the window, Elias could see a woman with silver hair arranging white lilies in a tall vase, her movements graceful and sure. Even from a distance, even after 30 years, he recognized the tilt of her head, the careful way she handled the delicate stems. Catherine had moved the same way when working in her small garden behind the ranch house, with a reverence for living things that bordered on the sacred. He stood on the sidewalk for 10 minutes, clutching Catherine's letter and fighting the urge to drive back to Montana without a word. What right did he have to disrupt Elizabeth's carefully constructed life? What right did he have to drag her back into grief that she had clearly found a way to transform into something beautiful? But as he watched her work, Elias remembered Catherine's words from the letter he had read so many times. He knew it by heart. Family is not a convenience to be maintained only when it's easy. Family is a commitment to love each other through the hardest times, to choose connection over comfort, to believe that the bonds that matter most are stronger than whatever tries to break them. Taking a deep breath that tasted of mountain air and possibility, Elias pushed open the door to Catherine's garden. A soft bell chimed overhead, and Elizabeth looked up from her flowers with eyes that were unmistakably Catherine's, the same warm brown, the same intelligence and kindness, aged by time but undimmed by the years. "Elias," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hello, Elizabeth," he replied, and felt 30 years of silence finally, mercifully, come to an end. They stood looking at each other across a shop filled with the beauty Catherine had loved. Two people who had survived the worst loss imaginable and somehow found their way back to each other. In Elizabeth's eyes, Elias saw his own grief reflected and understood, and for the first time in 3 decades, he did not feel alone with his sorrow. "I brought her letter," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "and some things I thought you should see. Things that show how much she loved you, how much she wanted you to be part of our lives." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "I have things to show you too. So many things I've been saving for this day without even knowing it." Elizabeth closed the flower shop early, turning the hand-painted sign to closed and drawing the curtains with the careful deliberation of someone preparing for a sacred ritual. She led Elias through the workroom behind the main shop, past buckets of fresh flowers and tables covered with ribbon and wire, to a small office that felt more like a shrine than a workplace. The walls were covered with photographs: Catherine as a young woman, Catherine on her wedding day, Catherine holding baby Tommy with a radiance that seemed to illuminate the black and white print. But it was the corner desk that stopped Elias cold. There, arranged with museum-like precision, sat a collection of letters still in their envelopes, each one addressed to him in Elizabeth's careful handwriting. "I wrote to you," Elizabeth said softly, following his gaze. "Every year, on the anniversary of the accident, every Christmas, every time something reminded me of Catherine, or when I needed to tell someone who would understand how much I missed her." She touched the top envelope with trembling fingers. "I wrote 47 letters over 30 years, and I never sent a single one." Elias stared at the stack of correspondence, overwhelmed by the revelation that Elizabeth had been reaching across the silence all along, had been trying to maintain the connection he thought was irreparably severed. "Why didn't you send them?" "Because I was afraid," she admitted, settling into a chair across from him. "Afraid you blamed me for their deaths, afraid that hearing from me would only make your pain worse. Afraid that you had moved on and didn't want reminders of what you had lost." "I blamed myself," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought if I had gone with them, if I hadn't let business come first, they would still be alive." Elizabeth's laugh held no humor, only the bitter recognition of shared delusion. "And I thought if I hadn't begged Catherine to bring Tommy for a visit, if I hadn't been so eager to show off my new baby, they would never have been on that mountain road when the flood came." They sat in silence, absorbing the magnitude of their mutual misunderstanding. For 30 years, each had carried guilt that belonged to the other in their minds, and neither guilt had belonged to either of them. The flood that killed Catherine and Tommy had been an act of nature, unpredictable and unstoppable, yet both survivors had spent 3 decades trying to accept responsibility for the uncontrollable. "There's something else," Elizabeth said, reaching for a manila folder on her desk. "Something I've never told anyone, not even my husband. Something I found out 2 years after the accident that changed everything I thought I knew about that day." She opened the folder and withdrew a yellowed newspaper clipping from the Grand Junction Daily Sentinel, dated the 15th of May, 1981. The headline read, "Bridge Collapse, Inquest Reveals Design Flaws." Below it was a photograph of the mountain road where Catherine and Tommy had died, showing the twisted remains of what had once been a bridge spanning a rushing creek. "I hired a private investigator," Elizabeth said, her voice steady but her hands shaking as she held the clipping. "I needed to know exactly what happened, needed to understand how they died. What I found out was that the bridge had been poorly maintained by the county, had known structural problems that engineers had warned about for 3 years before the accident." Elias felt the world tilt around him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying they didn't die because of the flood," Elizabeth said, tears streaming down her face. "They died because a bridge that should have held their weight collapsed under them. The stagecoach didn't get swept away by rising water. It fell through rotten timbers into the creek below. The county knew the bridge was dangerous and did nothing to fix it." The revelation hit Elias like a physical blow. All these years, he had pictured Catherine and Tommy drowning in floodwaters, had imagined them calling for help that never came. But the truth was different. They had died instantly when the bridge gave way, victims not of natural disaster, but of human negligence. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice hollow with shock. "Because you had disappeared," Elizabeth said. "Because you wouldn't take my calls or answer my letters. And later, because I thought it would only make the pain worse. What difference did it make how they died? They were still gone." "It makes all the difference in the world," Elias said, standing and walking to the window where spring rain was beginning to fall. "All these years, I've been torturing myself with images of them suffering, drowning, afraid. But if the bridge collapsed, it would have been instantaneous," Elizabeth said gently. "They wouldn't have had time to be afraid. They wouldn't have suffered." The weight that had sat on Elias's chest for 30 years shifted, not disappearing but transforming into something different. The guilt remained, but it was no longer the crushing certainty that his choices had killed his family. They had died through no fault of his, no fault of Elizabeth's, no fault of anyone except bureaucrats who had ignored engineers' warnings about a dangerous bridge. "I sued the county," Elizabeth continued. "Used the settlement money to start the flower shop, to create something beautiful in Catherine's memory. But I've never been able to enjoy the victory, if you can call it that. Justice for the dead doesn't bring them back." Elias turned from the window to find Elizabeth watching him with the same expression of desperate hope he felt in his own heart. "You've been carrying this alone for 28 years?" "I've been carrying everything alone," she said. "The guilt, the truth, the memories. Just like you have. We've both been so afraid of causing each other more pain that we've lived with unbearable pain instead." On impulse, Elias reached into his jacket and withdrew Catherine's letter, the one she had written to Elizabeth, but never had the chance to send. Maybe it's time we stopped carrying everything alone. Maybe it's time we read what Catherine wanted to tell you. Together. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she took the envelope, studying her sister's familiar handwriting as if it were a message from beyond the grave. Are you sure? This was meant for me, but after 30 years. After 30 years, I think Catherine would want us both to hear her voice, Elias said. I think she'd want us to stop punishing ourselves and start honoring the love she believed in. Elizabeth nodded and carefully opened the envelope, unfolding the letter with the reverence due a sacred text. Catherine's voice seemed to fill the small room as Elizabeth read aloud. My dearest sister, I am writing this on the train to Denver, watching Tommy color in his book while the mountains slide past our window. He is so excited to meet his new cousin, and I am so grateful that you have given me another reason to believe in the future. Elias worries that I travel too much, that I take too many risks, but I want our son to know his family, to understand that love extends beyond the boundaries of our ranch. I want him to know his Aunt Elizabeth, who taught me that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to love despite fear. I have been thinking about Mother's words to us when we were girls. That family is not just about sharing blood, but about choosing to share life. You and I have chosen each other again and again, through childhood scrapes and young woman's heartbreaks, through my wedding day and your divorce, through all the seasons of sisterhood. I want you to know that if anything ever happens to me, if Elias ever seems lost or alone, please don't let him disappear into his grief. He has such a big heart, but he guards it so fiercely. Help him remember that love is not diminished by sharing it, that joy is not betraying the memory of sorrow. Tell my son stories about his mother when she was young and foolish and brave. Tell him that love is the strongest force in the universe, stronger than fear, stronger than loss, stronger even than death. All my love, always and forever, Catherine. The silence that followed was not empty but full. Full of recognition, of forgiveness, of the understanding that they had both been living according to Catherine's wisdom without realizing it. She had known that love required courage, that family demanded the willingness to risk pain for the sake of connection, that healing meant choosing hope over fear. She knew, Elizabeth whispered. Somehow, she knew we would need each other. And she knew we were too stubborn to admit it, Elias added, wiping tears from his eyes. But she also knew that love was patient enough to wait 30 years for us to figure it out. Outside, the rain had stopped, and afternoon sunlight was streaming through the windows of the flower shop, illuminating the photographs of Catherine and casting everything in the golden light of forgiveness and new beginnings. 3 weeks after returning from Colorado, Elias stood in the early morning light of his kitchen, studying the sketches spread across the table like blueprints for rebuilding his heart. Catherine's garden plans lay before him in all their careful detail, hand-drawn diagrams showing where to plant roses and lavender, where to place the stone bench she had dreamed of, where to create the walking paths that would wind between flower beds and vegetable plots. Elizabeth had found the sketches among Catherine's papers, preserved all these years in a cedar chest that had somehow survived when so much else was lost. The drawings were dated from the winter before the accident, when Catherine had spent long evenings planning the garden that would transform the bare ground behind the ranch house into something beautiful and purposeful. She wanted to plant healing herbs, Elias said to Maria, who was measuring coffee and listening with the patient attention she brought to all important conversations. Chamomile for calm, lavender for peace, rosemary for remembrance. She wrote notes in the margins about which plants would help with which troubles. Your Catherine was a wise woman, Maria observed. She understood that gardens heal more than just the ground they grow in. The decision to create Catherine's garden had emerged naturally from his visit with Elizabeth, who had agreed to come to Montana for the memorial ceremony they were planning. It would be the first time she had visited the ranch since Catherine's wedding 30 years ago, the first time the sisters' dreams would be honored in the place they had called home. Jake appeared in the doorway, mud on his boots and satisfaction on his weathered face. "The soil's ready," he announced. "Turned and amended, just like the extension office recommended. That ground behind the house is going to grow whatever you plant in it." Over the past weeks, the entire ranch had become involved in the garden project. Jake had supervised the soil preparation with the same careful attention he brought to pasture management. Maria had contacted local nurseries to source the specific plants Catherine had sketched. Even the hired hands had contributed, clearing rocks and building the stone borders that would define the garden beds. "Elizabeth called last night," Elias said, folding Catherine's garden plans with careful reverence. "Her flight gets in Thursday morning. She'll stay through the weekend for the memorial service." "How are you feeling about seeing her again?" Jake asked, settling into his customary chair at the kitchen table. The question required honest consideration. The reunion with Elizabeth had cracked something open inside Elias's chest, had allowed light and air into spaces that had been sealed shut for 30 years. But it had also awakened feelings he was not sure he was ready to handle: grief that was fresh as yesterday's pain, love that had never died despite his best efforts to bury it, and hope that felt as fragile as spring ice on the lake. "Nervous," he admitted. "Good nervous, but nervous all the same. We've started something that we can't take back, Elizabeth and I. Once we honor Catherine and Tommy properly, once we create this memorial, there's no pretending anymore that they're not gone or that we don't need each other." Maria's smile was gentle but knowing. "Perhaps that is exactly what you need. No more pretending, no more hiding from the truth. Catherine is gone, but her love is not. Tommy is gone, but his joy is not. And you, Senor Boone, are still here, still capable of honoring them by living fully instead of just surviving." The memorial service had grown beyond Elias's original vision. Word had spread through the community about the garden project, and people had begun calling to ask if they could attend the ceremony. Mrs. Henderson, Tommy's third-grade teacher, now retired but still living in town. Dr. Patterson, who had delivered Tommy and cared for Catherine during her pregnancy. The pastor from the church where Elias and Catherine had been married, though Elias had not darkened its doors since the funeral. "The whole county's talking about it," Jake said. "Folks remember Catherine and Tommy fondly. They want to pay their respects, want to be part of honoring their memory." The idea of so many people witnessing his grief terrified Elias, but it also felt right in a way he could not fully explain. Catherine had been beloved in the community, known for her kindness and her bright spirit. Tommy had been the kind of child who charmed adults and befriended every animal on the ranch. They deserved to be remembered by everyone whose lives they had touched, not just by a grieving man who had spent 30 years trying to forget. In his study that evening, Elias worked on the speech he would give at the memorial service, struggling to find words that could encompass 30 years of love and loss, regret and redemption. The pages around him were covered with false starts and crossed-out sentences, attempts to capture emotions too large for language. Catherine's flower book lay open beside him, its pressed blooms still vibrant despite their age. Each flower was labeled not just with its name and date, but with a memory Catherine had wanted to preserve. "Wild roses from the creek bank, June 3rd, 1978. Picked these while Tommy chased butterflies, and Elias pretended not to watch us from the barn." The note made him smile despite his tears. She had known, even then, that his gruff exterior hid a heart that melted every time he watched his family find joy in simple things. She had understood that his love showed itself not in words, but in the way he stopped working to watch their happiness, the way he made sure they had everything they needed to flourish. "I don't know how to say goodbye to you again," he wrote on a fresh sheet of paper. "I said goodbye 30 years ago, and I thought that was the end. But the lake gave you back to me, gave us both back to Elizabeth, and now I have to find a way to say hello and goodbye at the same time." He paused, remembering Catherine's letter to Elizabeth, the wisdom she had shared about love being stronger than death. about family being a choice to stay connected despite fear and loss. Maybe that's what this memorial is really about, he continued writing. Not saying goodbye, but saying hello to the rest of our lives. Hello to a future where your love lives on in every flower that blooms in this garden, in every memory we share with Elizabeth, in every moment when we choose connection over isolation. The next morning brought news that complicated his carefully laid plans. A spring storm was moving across the Rockies, threatening to dump rain or even snow on the day of the memorial service. Jake brought the weather report along with his coffee, his face creased with concern. "Could be ugly," he said, studying the forecast. "Heavy rain at minimum, possibly snow above 6,000 feet. We might need to move the ceremony indoors." "No," Elias said immediately. "Catherine planned this garden to be outside, under the sky she loved. We'll hold the service here no matter what the weather brings. She never let a little rain stop her from doing what mattered." Maria looked up from her breakfast preparation, eyebrows raised. "You would risk everyone's health for sentiment?" "I would honor my wife's memory the way she would have wanted," Elias replied firmly. Catherine loved storms. She used to stand on the porch during thunderstorms, watching the lightning and breathing in the rain-washed air. She said storms reminded her that the world was bigger than whatever troubles we carried. As if summoned by their conversation, Elizabeth called that afternoon with news of her own. "I'm bringing something special," she said, her voice bright with excitement despite the crackling phone connection. "Something I think Catherine would have wanted at her memorial service." "What kind of something?" "A surprise. But I will say this, it has to do with the garden plans you showed me." Catherine was more organized than either of us realized. She didn't just plan where to plant things. She planned what they would mean, what they would represent. This memorial is going to be more meaningful than you could have imagined. That evening, as Elias walked the property in the gathering dusk, he felt the presence of change in the air, not just the approaching storm, but something deeper and more permanent. The garden site behind the house was ready, the soil dark and rich with possibility. Tomorrow Elizabeth would arrive, carrying whatever surprise she had discovered in Catherine's papers. This weekend, they would plant the memorial garden and speak words that had been 30 years in the waiting. For the first time since finding the chest in the lake, Elias felt ready for whatever came next. The fear was still there, but it was balanced now by something stronger, the knowledge that he was not facing this alone, that Catherine's love had found a way to bring her scattered family back together, and that some things were worth the risk of hoping again. The storm might come, but they would weather it together. And when it passed, something beautiful would grow in its wake, just as Catherine had always believed it would. The morning of the memorial service dawned grey and heavy, with clouds that hung low over the mountains like a congregation gathering for prayer. Elizabeth had arrived the evening before, carrying a leather satchel that she guarded as carefully as a mother protecting her child. She had refused to reveal its contents, saying only that Catherine's surprise would be worth the wait. By 10 o'clock, people began arriving, despite the threatening weather. They came in pickup trucks and sedans, carrying folding chairs and covered dishes, treating the memorial like the community celebration Catherine would have wanted it to be. Mrs. Henderson arrived with a photo album from Tommy's school years. Dr. Patterson brought his wife and a bouquet of wild roses from his own garden. The pastor came early to help arrange chairs around the garden site. Elias stood on his porch, watching the gathering crowd, overwhelmed by the realization that Catherine and Tommy's memory had touched so many lives. These people had not forgotten, had not moved on, and left his family's story behind. They had been waiting, like him, for permission to remember aloud. "You ready for this?" Jake asked, joining him on the porch. "No," Elias said honestly, "but Catherine was ready for everything, and she's the one we're honoring today." The memorial stone had been delivered that morning, a piece of Montana granite with Catherine and Tommy Boone's names engraved in elegant script, along with the dates of their birth and death, and below that the words Elizabeth had suggested, Their love blooms eternal in every flower, every heart, every season of renewal. Maria emerged from the house, carrying a tray of coffee and cookies. Her best dress, protected by the apron, she wore like armor against all of life's challenges. "Senor Boone," she said, "Elizabeth is asking for you. She says it is time for Catherine's surprise." Elizabeth waited in the kitchen, her satchel open on the table, and tears streaming down her face. Inside the bag, Elias could see a collection of seed packets, each one labeled in Catherine's careful handwriting with planting instructions and personal notes. "She planned it all," Elizabeth said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not just where to plant things, but what each plant would mean. Look," she held up a packet of sunflower seeds. "For Tommy, because he loved how they followed the sun across the sky. And these," she showed him packets of forget-me-nots. "For remembrance," she wrote, "so that anyone who visits will know they are remembered." Elias examined the packets with wonder. Catherine had planned not just a garden, but a living memorial where every plant would carry meaning, every bloom would tell part of their story. There were marigolds for devotion, sweet peas for lasting pleasure, morning glories for love that transcends death. "How did you find these?" "In the folder with the garden plans," Elizabeth said. She had ordered them from a catalogue, had them delivered just before the trip. "I found the receipt. She bought enough seeds to plant this garden 3 times over, as if she knew how much growth would be needed." Through the window, they could see the assembled crowd beginning to migrate toward the garden site. Children ran between the adults, while dogs wandered freely, creating the kind of joyful chaos that Catherine had always loved. This was not a somber funeral gathering, but a celebration of lives that had mattered, of love that continued to bear fruit decades after its source had been taken away. "I think it's time," Elias said, picking up the memorial stone with Jake's help. Together they carried it to the garden, where Maria had arranged Catherine's pressed flower book and Tommy's wooden horse on a small table covered with her best white tablecloth. The crowd fell silent as Elias approached, their faces expectant and kind. He had practiced his speech a dozen times, but looking at these people who had gathered to honor his family, all his prepared words seemed inadequate. 30 years ago," he began, his voice carrying across the assembled gathering, "I lost my wife and son to a bridge collapse on a mountain road. For all these years, I've been trying to figure out how to live with that loss, how to carry their memory without being crushed by it." He paused, looking at Elizabeth, who nodded encouragingly. 3 weeks ago, something extraordinary happened. The lake gave back what it had taken, Catherine's hope chest, filled with letters and memories and dreams we never had the chance to fulfill. But more than that, it gave me back my family. He gestured toward Elizabeth. It reminded me that love doesn't die just because the people we love are gone. It reminded me that family is a choice we make every day, to stay connected despite distance, despite grief, despite fear. Mrs. Henderson wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. "Doctor." Patterson reached for his wife's hand. The pastor bowed his head in prayer. "Catherine planned this garden as a place of beauty and healing," Elias continued. "She chose every plant for its meaning, every flower for its message. Today, we plant not just a memorial to the dead, but a promise to the living that love continues, that beauty endures, and that some things are stronger than death itself." Elizabeth stepped forward, carrying a small wooden box that Elias recognized as one of Catherine's jewelry containers. "Before we plant Catherine's garden," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, "I want to create something new, something that honors not just their memory, but our hope for the future." She opened the box to reveal an assortment of small items, coins from different years, letters written by various community members, photographs of the ranch through the decades, and a piece of paper on which she had written the date and the names of everyone present. "This is a time capsule," Elizabeth announced, "to be opened in 10 years, when this garden is fully mature, when the healing it represents has had time to take root and grow. Each of us will add something, a memory, a hope, a promise about how we'll honor Catherine and Tommy's legacy in the years to come. Tommy's wooden horse found its place in the time capsule first, nestled carefully among the other treasures. Elias added a small stone from the lake where the chest had surfaced, and Catherine's wedding ring, which he had worn on a chain around his neck since finding it. Elizabeth contributed a pressed flower from Catherine's collection and a letter she had written to her sister that very morning. One by one, the gathered community members approached the box. Mrs. Henderson added a photograph of Tommy from his school days and a note about the scholarship fund she was establishing in his name. Dr. Patterson contributed a baby rattle, explaining that every child he had helped bring into the world carried a blessing that Catherine and Tommy had taught him about the preciousness of life. Jake added a horseshoe nail from the barn, where he had taught Tommy to curry horses, and Maria included a recipe card with Catherine's cornbread recipe, the one that tasted like sunshine. Even the pastor contributed something, a small cross carved from wood that had grown on the ranch, blessed during the service Catherine and Tommy's funeral 30 years ago. As the light rain that had been threatening all morning began to fall, the ceremony took on an even more sacred quality. No one reached for umbrellas or sought shelter. Instead, they stood together in Catherine's garden, letting the water bless their efforts as they prepared to plant seeds that would grow into living remembrance. Catherine loved rain, Elias said, looking up at the grey sky with the first genuine smile he had worn in public for 30 years. She said it was nature's way of reminding us that growth requires both sunshine and storms, that the most beautiful things come from the marriage of light and shadow. The actual planting became a communal effort. Elizabeth scattered the sunflower seeds while sharing stories of Tommy's fascination with their daily journey across the sky. Mrs. Henderson planted the forget-me-nots while reciting memories of her former student's gentle spirit and curious mind. Dr. Patterson and his wife worked together to establish the roses that would bloom each June in celebration of Catherine's birthday. As they worked, the rain continued to fall, not the torrential downpour that had been predicted, but a gentle, steady blessing that soaked into the rich soil and promised good growing conditions for the plants they were establishing. The memorial stone, now positioned at the center of the garden, seemed to glow with quiet dignity in the soft light. "There's one more thing," Elizabeth said as the planting neared completion. She produced a manila envelope from her bag and withdrew a legal document that made Elias's breath catch in his throat. "The settlement money from the lawsuit against the county, I never felt right keeping it. It was blood money, payment for lives that couldn't be replaced." She held up the check, made out for an amount that represented decades of interest on the original settlement. "I want to establish the Catherine and Tommy Boone Foundation for bridge safety. Every bridge in this county will be properly maintained, properly inspected, properly cared for. No other family will lose what we lost because of government negligence." The crowd erupted in applause, but Elias found himself overwhelmed by an emotion too powerful for words. Elizabeth had transformed their tragedy into protection for others, had found a way to honor Catherine and Tommy by ensuring their death served a purpose that extended far beyond personal grief. "They would love this," he managed to say. "Catherine always said that love was meant to be shared, that the best way to honor loss was to prevent others from experiencing the same pain." As the ceremony concluded, with everyone joining hands around the newly planted garden, Elias felt something he had not experienced in 30 years, complete peace with his grief. The pain was still there, would always be there, but it no longer felt like a burden he had to carry alone. It had become something shared, something transformed by community and love into a force for healing rather than destruction. The time capsule was buried beneath the memorial stone, carrying their promises and hopes into the future. In 10 years, they would return to this garden to see how their plantings had grown, how their healing had progressed, how their love had multiplied and spread through the community like seeds on fertile ground. 6 months later, Elias stood at the edge of his lake in the early morning light, holding a new fishing net in weathered hands that no longer shook with grief. The October air carried the scent of changing leaves and wood smoke from the ranch house chimney, where Maria was preparing breakfast for the extended family that had gradually taken shape around the kitchen table. Catherine's garden had exceeded every expectation. The sunflowers had grown tall and proud, their faces tracking the sun's journey across the Montana sky, just as Tommy would have done. The roses bloomed with such abundance that Maria had taken to cutting fresh bouquets for every room in the house. The forget-me-nots had spread beyond their original borders, creating a blue carpet that seemed to flow like water through the other plantings. But it was the people who visited the garden that had surprised Elias most. Word of Catherine and Tommy's memorial had spread far beyond the local community, drawing families who had lost loved ones and needed a place to honor their own grief. The garden had become an unexpected pilgrimage site, a place where sorrow could be transformed into beauty, where death could be acknowledged without being feared. Uncle Elias? The voice belonged to Sarah, Elizabeth's daughter, who had driven up from Colorado with her own children for the autumn visit that had become a cherished tradition. At 31, she carried her mother's grace and her Aunt Catherine's smile, along with a warm acceptance of the uncle she had never known existed until this year. "Good morning, Sarah," Elias called back, setting down his net to embrace his great-nephew Michael and great-niece Emma, who had run ahead of their mother through the morning mist. At 8 and 6, they were the same age as Tommy and Catherine would have been when their imagined siblings were born, and their presence filled a hollow space in Elias's heart that he had not even known existed. "Mama says you're going to teach us to fish today," Emma announced, her eyes bright with the excitement that reminded Elias painfully and joyfully of Tommy's endless enthusiasm for new adventures. "If that's what you'd like to learn," Elias said, hefting his new net. "Though I should warn you that fishing requires patience, and patience is something that has to be practiced like piano scales or multiplication tables." Michael, serious in the way that 8-year-old boys could be when contemplating important matters, studied the lake with the concentration of a future rancher. "Mom says you found a treasure chest in this lake. Is that really true?" "The truest thing that ever happened to me," Elias replied. "But the real treasure wasn't the chest itself. The real treasure was what it taught me about family and love, and how some things that seem lost forever are just waiting for the right moment to come home." Elizabeth emerged from the ranch house, carrying thermoses of hot chocolate and wearing the comfortable smile of a woman who had found her way back to where she belonged. The past 6 months had brought her to Montana once a month, sometimes with Sarah and the children, sometimes alone when she needed the quiet peace that only the ranch could provide. "The foundation received another donation yesterday," she said, settling on a fallen log that served as an impromptu bench. "A family in Wyoming whose son was killed in a bridge collapse 2 years ago. They want to help prevent other tragedies." The Catherine and Tommy Boone Foundation had grown beyond their wildest expectations, funded not just by Elizabeth's settlement money, but by contributions from people across the country who had been touched by the story of love transcending loss. Already, they had funded safety inspections for 43 bridges in rural counties, mandated engineering reviews for dozens more, and established an emergency fund for families affected by infrastructure failures. "Catherine would be proud," Elias said, watching his great-niece attempt to catch minnows with her bare hands, while her brother explained more efficient fishing techniques. She always believed that good could come from even the worst circumstances if people were willing to work together. Jake approached from the barn, leading a gentle mare saddled for the children's riding lesson. At 56, he had officially become ranch foreman emeritus, training Sarah's husband David to eventually take over operations while Elias gradually transitioned from owner to grandfather figure. The arrangement suited everyone. Jake got to mentor without carrying full responsibility, David learned ranching from a master, and Elias discovered the joy of having genuine partners in the enterprise that had once isolated him from human connection. "The new bulls are settling in well," Jake reported. "David's got good instincts for reading cattle. Give him another year and he'll be ready to run this place without either of us looking over his shoulder." Maria's voice carried across the yard, calling everyone to breakfast with the authority of a woman accustomed to being obeyed by men, children, and occasionally stubborn livestock. As the extended family made their way toward the house, Elias lingered for a moment at the lake's edge, grateful for the solitude that allowed him to speak to Catherine in the way that had become his morning ritual. "They're good kids," he said to the water that had returned his family to him. "Tommy would have loved teaching them about the ranch, showing them secret places, and telling them stories about how things grow. I think I'm finally learning to do those things for him." The new fishing net felt different in his hands, lighter somehow, though it was identical in construction to the one that had pulled up the rusted chest 6 months ago. This one carried no weight of desperate solitude, no burden of grief that threatened to drag him down into the depths. This net was a tool for sharing joy rather than seeking sorrow, for teaching children about patience and wonder rather than drowning in memories of loss. As he walked toward the ranch house, where laughter spilled from windows bright with morning light, Elias understood that healing was not about forgetting the past or moving beyond grief. Healing was about allowing love to grow larger than loss, about choosing connection over isolation, about trusting that some things were indeed stronger than death itself. The lake behind him reflected the autumn sky like a mirror, its surface calm and accepting, ready for whatever treasures the future might bring to light.